In today's tutorial, we're going to be creating this particular sci-fi loop completely using geometry nodes. We're going to go step by step and break down every individual aspect. So let's actually start off the tutorial. We're going to build this in 5 separate parts. That is, these side panels over here, the central floor, after which we'll take care of these bridges, then these circles, which is going to act as our lighting, and finally the outer walls. So each of those are going to have their own separate trees that are all going to be joined in at the end, after which we'll deal with all of the materials and finally the animation. So let's begin. In our default scene, we're going to bring our cursor to the junction of these two windows, click and drag to create a new window, and we'll change this to the geometry node editor. Then we'll press this plus button to create a new geometry node tree, and then we'll just zoom in, select the group input, and tap X to delete it. Now, as I stated, the first thing that we're going to do are the two side panels. Since we want 2 copies of the side panel, what I'll do is I'll search for a curved line, and I'll simply plug this into the group output, and then I'll instance on the 2 ends whatever we want. So since we want the 2 ends to be on the 2 sides, we're going to change the start and end from a value of 000,001 to a value of 1 on the x-axis for the start and a value of -1 on the x-axis for the end. But I'll also remove the z value from 1 to 0. So that way we get these 2 points. Now on these 2 points, we want to instance 2 grids. So I'll press Shift A, search for an instance on points node, plug that in after the curved line, and for the instance, I'll search for a grid. Now I want these to be on the y-axis, so I'm going to go ahead and increase the size on the y from a value of 1 to a value of 10. And similarly, if we go into wireframe view, you can see how the actual vertices are. I want these to have many more vertices along the y-axis, so I'll go ahead and just start increasing this value till I get something that I like. So I think I'm going to increase the number of vertices on the x-axis to 4, and I'm going to change the vertices on the y to something like 12. Now we can switch off wireframe view again by pressing this button, and we can go ahead and give this some sort of inset and delete the faces. Now since we can't do insetting in geometry nodes directly, the way we'll go about it is by searching for an extrude mesh node, and instead of extruding it up, we'll change the offset scale to 0 itself, and then search for a scale elements node, and we'll scale all of the faces down by a value of maybe 0.9. Now I don't want all of the faces to be extruded, but I want only the top faces of this extrude mesh to be scaled down, after which we can delete these same faces. So we can press Shift A, search for a delete geometry, and for the selection plug this same top in, and that way the faces are deleted. However, we currently have all of them selected. We'll click only faces, and we don't want point, we want face, and that way we keep these borders and only these insetted faces are deleted, which is exactly what we wanted. Next up, these are currently just thin lines. I want to give it some amount of thickness, so I'll just extrude it once again by searching for an extrude mesh node and plugging it in after the delete geometry. I'll reduce the offset scale down to something like 0.1 or even lower, and that should be all right. Now the individual doesn't make a difference in this scenario, and I don't care about the bottom, so I'm not going to bother joining it with the original version. It'll just remain as this empty hole, but I'll keep individual unchecked because that way we just get a fewer number of faces created, so it should be a very tiny bit faster in performance. If you actually want to see how long each of these nodes are taking, you can also expand this and switch on timing so that you can see the difference that it makes. So right now I can see that actually switching on individual makes this final calculation only 1.6 milliseconds. But if I switch it off, it becomes 0.44 milliseconds. So that way we can see that switching it off is actually speeding it up. So we're going to keep it off. Now that we're done with the side panel, we can select them, press Ctrl J, go to the node tab over here and label this as side panels. Now let's go ahead and create the floor. So we'll press Shift A, search for a join geometry, plug that in just before this so that we can have all of these added into the same tree. Now press Shift A, search for a grid, and we can directly plug this into the join geometry, and we have to scale it up accordingly. So let's go ahead and change the scale on the Y till it matches, which should match at a value of 10. And then I just want to extrude this up a bit. So I'll press Shift A, search for an extrude mesh node, and again uncheck individual. I don't need so many vertices, also I can reduce that as well. And I'll just bring this offset scale down to something like 0.2, and that way it'll just be slightly above these panels, which looks good enough for me. Now again, press Ctrl J and call this floor. The next one is going to be a slightly more complex one, which is creating the actual bridges. Now since we're going to be tiling this, I want one bridge at the start and one bridge at the center. And then when we actually tile this, the bridge at the start of the next one will come over here, which is absolutely perfect as we want. So to create those 2 bridges, I'll again use the same method that we used over here, which is search for a curved line and instance the bridges onto it. I'll take those 3 nodes and replicate them over here. So I'll press Shift A, search for a curved line, plug that into the join geometry, and this time I want it to go from the center to the end. So I'll keep the start at 000 itself, and the end I'll change this to a value of -5 5 on the Y. So that way it should be right over here. Next, I'll press Shift A and search for an instance on points node, plug that in over here. And just to make sure that we're in the right place, I'll press Shift A and search for a UV sphere, plug that into the instance, and you can see that it is in the absolute start and the end. So now we can remove it. Now on these, I want to instance two curves that are going to go along the x-axis. So I'll press Shift A, search for another curve line, and I'll plug this into the instance. But we want it to go on the x-axis, so I'll change the start value to -4 on the x and the end value to +4 on the x, and I'll reduce this z value down to 0. Now these two curves can be controlled by using the handles the same way how we would control normal Bezier curves. So you can see if we take a Bezier curve and we go into edit mode, we have these handles that we can select. We can rotate the handles, we can select each side of the handle and actually grab them individually, which determines the shape of the curve. So we can do that in geometry nodes as well by selecting the handle types and also choosing each control point of the handles and manipulating them. Let's just select these, press X to delete them, and just delete the entire object as well. Select our geometry node object again, and now the first thing is we need to convert this to a Bezier curve so that we can actually get access to the handles. So press Shift A, search for set spline type, and this time change it from poly to Bezier. Now we have to actually manipulate the handles. So I'll press Shift A, search for a set handle type, and since I want this to just go like that, I don't want the handles towards the left to affect the handles towards the right, and in this case I don't want the handle towards the right to affect the handle towards the left, because it just ends off over here. So that's why I'm going to change this from auto to free, and that way we get access to individual handles without having the other one influence it. To actually show what I mean, I'll add in another Bezier curve, GX, scale it up, and just show you what I mean. So right now, if I was to take this particular handle and say GZ, you can see the other handle is also affecting it. If I take this handle and keep it at x equal to 0, this handle also moves accordingly. But I want to just control this handle separately. So if I take this and I type V free, then I can take just the right handle and press GZ and move it without affecting this one. This one can do whatever it wants, but the curve is no longer affected by it. That's exactly what we want to do. That way on this one as well, I can make it free, select this one and just go GZ, and that way we'll get this particular shape. So let's create that exact thing in geometry nodes. So now, since both of these right and left have been set to free, I can choose each handle and set the position. So I'll press Shift A, search for a set handle positions, plug this in over here, and for the left handles, I'm going to increase the Z value to something like 4, and I want to do the same thing for the right handles as well. So I'll take this, press Shift D, plug it in over here, change it to right, and there we have the shape. Now of course 4 seems way too high, so I'll reduce this down to 2 and 2. Now that looks good enough for my bridge. Next, we actually need this to have some sort of material. That is, the actual bridge has to be created. So let's convert these curves into meshes by searching for a curve to mesh node, plugging that in after the instance on points, and for the profile curve I want another curve line so that it becomes a flat bridge. So I'll press Shift A, search for a curve line, and plug that into the profile curve. Now if we keep it on the z-axis, you can see the shape is clearly not right. We want it to be horizontal like this, but it's going vertically. So I'll reduce this back to 0, and I'll change the y value, and even that is not giving me what I want. So I'll bring that back to 0 as well, and I'll change the x. So now I can give the x some value, let's say -0.5, and remember we're doing minus because if we duplicate this again, it's going to start perfectly over here. If we were to reduce this to the front, there's going to be some overlap and things like that, and that's why we changed this to -0.5. Although it would work with positive values as well, I'll keep it at maybe a value of -1. Now if we change this back to our wireframe view, you can see how the wireframes are created. So that looks pretty cool. But if I want to actually texture this, one thing that I can do is create a bunch of small extrusions, which gives it a more sci-fi feel in my opinion. So I'll go ahead and actually subdivide this by searching for a subdivide mesh node, plugging that in after the curve to mesh, and just increasing the count to something like 2 or even 3 might work. And now I'm going to extrude each of these faces and then scale them down. So I'll press Shift A, search for an extrude mesh node, keep it on faces itself and keep it on individual, but I'm not going to keep the offset scale this high. I'm going to reduce the offset scale till it comes outward. So because of the shape of the curve and everything, for it to go up, the offset scale has to be negative. So I'll change it to -0.05, and there we have this. But right now I don't like the smooth shading of it, so I want to shade it flat. I'll press Shift A, search for a set shade smooth node, and if you just uncheck this shade smooth, it gets shaded to flat. But right now, every single one of these are extruded to the same amount, and that doesn't look nice. I want to actually change the scale of each of these faces. So again, I'll search for a scale elements node, plug that in, and take this top, plug that into the selection. And now if I change the scale to 0.9, you can see how these sci-fi looking grid pattern is created. So the scale is up to you. I'll go with maybe 0.8. Now I think that's all for the bridges. I'll select all of them and then press Ctrl J and then label this as bridges. Next up, we wanted to create those circles. So we're going to use the exact same method once again. Press Shift A, search for a curved line, give the curved line the right dimensions, which means we want it to start on the Y axis at a value of -5, and we want it to end on the Y axis at a value of 5, and we want a value of 0 on the Z axis. Now we can plug this into the join geometry. So just take it and join it up. Remember, I'm using Alt right mouse to connect them, but if you want to use that same shortcut, you have to have the node wrangler switched on. So you can go to your edit preferences and add in the node wrangler. Anyway, now if we were to instance on this, we'd get only one circle at one end and another circle on the other end. We want more circles to be present, so I can search for a resample curve node, plug that in after the curve line, and now I can select how many circles I want. So I think within this distance, I want 4 circles, which means for each of these, I'll get 1 circle and 1 circle in between. So I'll go ahead and change this count to something like 4, and then I can instance on these the actual circles. But because we're in 3D, we're not going to use a circle, we're going to use a torus. So I'll press Shift A, search for an instance on points node, and for the instance, I need to create a torus. So to create a torus in geometry nodes, you can search for a curve circle, and you can convert the curve circle to a mesh using a curve to mesh node. And again, for the profile curve, use another curve circle. So press Shift D. For this one, you can reduce the radius down to 0.1 and plug that into the profile curve, and take this and plug that into the instance of the instance on points. Now we can see that the orientation is not correct. We want them to be turned on the x-axis by 90 degrees. So we can rotate it on the x-axis by 90, and there we have it. But we want to also increase their scale. So you can do that by changing the radius over here or the scale values here. If you change the scale values over here, the torus might become too fat as well. So you can just look at what the differences are. So Shift left click and dragging selects all of them, and now you can just increase all of them, and you can see how the torus is also becoming fatter. On the other hand, if you keep this at 1 and you change this radius of this curved circle, the torus remains thin. So I think I'm going to keep it thin itself, and I'm going to bring these a little smaller, and I'll lift them up as well. So I finally went with a radius of 2.5 and a radius of the torus itself as 0.0625, after which I want to actually move these up. So I'll press Shift A and search for a set position node, plug that in after the instance on points, and just lift it on the Z axis till you get it to someplace nice. So I'll go with maybe 1.1 meters. Now there are a few issues. The first thing is this is way too jagged. You can clearly see each of the edges. So to change that, I'm just going to increase this resolution to something like 128 to make it nice and smooth. Then if you actually take a look at this, we have one here and we have one here as well. So that's going to overlap when we actually instance this. So we want to end it one section before itself. So since this is 10 units long and we want to divide it into 4 equal parts, we're actually going to have to make each part equal to 0.25, which is 10 divided by 4. And that's why what we'll do is we'll actually change this value from 5 to 5 minus 0.25. 5 minus 2.5. 10 divided by 4 is 2.5. I don't know why I kept saying 0.25, but yeah, we'll subtract 2.5 and make this 2.5 itself. And that way it just ends here. And the next section will get this circle right here, which will make it perfectly looping. And that way we actually get one circle for one bridge and one circle without a bridge. So that looks perfectly all right. And we can go ahead and select all of these, press Ctrl J and call this circles. Now we're done with 4 of these. We have to finish off the last section, which is actually creating the outer walls. And since I'm continuously going down, I'll actually create the walls on top. We'll use a process very similar to what we've been doing so long, which is searching for a curved line, plugging that directly into the join geometry and changing the length to start from this edge and end at this edge. So we'll go ahead and change the start value on the Y to -5. We'll change the end value to a value of 5, but we don't want it to go up on the Z axis. So we'll change this to 0. And now we'll just convert this into a mesh by searching for a curve to mesh node. And for the profile curve, we'll use a curved circle with a resolution down to 4. So reduce the resolution to 4 and plug this into the profile curve. Now we need to obviously increase its size. So I'll go ahead and expand the radius until our circles fit perfectly in. So I think a radius of 5 will be perfect. Now the next issue is that it's shaded smooth, so you can't see these edges. And I don't want that. I want it to be clear walls, and walls do have edges. So I'm going to use the same method of removing the set shade smooth, which is using a set shade smooth node and unchecking this button here. And that way you can see each of the walls, and that looks perfectly all right. Now let's select these, press Ctrl J and label this as walls. Now that's it for the actual construction. The next thing that we're going to do is the texturing. So for the texturing, we need 5 materials. So let's go to the material properties, add in 5 material slots by pressing this button 4 more times because the default material is there as well. Then we'll change the default material to the first thing that we created. So let's say panels, then let's select the next one, press this plus button and just name this as the floor. Take this one, new, name it as bridges, select the fourth material, add a new material, call it circles, and then select the last one, press new, and call this walls. Now we have to assign these to each of the branches. So let's go into the walls, press Shift A, search for a set material, plug that in and choose walls. Then take this, press Shift D, plug that in here. Again, Shift D, plug it in here, Shift D, plug it in here, Shift D, plug it in here. Maybe we can take this one and just bring it down to keep it organized. And now let's zoom in. Remember, this one's coming from the side panels, so we'll go ahead and name this panels. This one is coming from the floor, so we'll go ahead and choose the floor material. This one is from the bridges, so let's select the bridges material. And finally, this one is coming from the circles, so we'll give it the circles material. Now to actually see the changes to each of the material, we'll go ahead and change our viewport shading to render. We'll also set all of our render defaults, which is switching on bloom and screen space reflections. Then we'll go to our world properties, change the background color to a very dark color, almost black, and we'll go to our geometry node window and change it to the shader editor. Finally, we don't need this default light, so we'll select it and press delete. Now with our geometry node selected again, first material that we'll deal with is these circles, so that we actually get lighting for the rest of the materials. So let's go to the materials, choose circles, and start playing around with it. We don't want the principal BSDF because we want them to be emissive, so we'll tap X after selecting the principal BSDF to remove it. Then I'll press Shift A and search for an emission node and plug that into the surface. Now I want this emission node to actually have a gradient which goes away from the camera. So assuming that the camera is here, the gradient should move as the camera moves. So to do that, I'll press Ctrl T with the node wrangler switched on to get in texture coordinate and mapping nodes. If that doesn't work for you or you don't have node wrangler switched on, just add in a texture coordinate and mapping node separately. Choose camera as the object from your texture coordinate, and then since we want a gradient, we search for a gradient node and plug the vector into the vector of the gradient node. Now to see this, we'll just select our camera, press Alt G, Alt R to clear location and rotation, and press GY -5 to bring it to the start of this object. Then we can press RX90 to just rotate it on the x-axis by 90 degrees and GZ2 to move it up by 2 units. Now this is essentially the location of the camera, and we're just placing that so that we can play around with the gradient properly and see how it moves. So now let's take this color and plug that into a math node so that we have more control over it. So search for a math node, change it to multiply, plug this color into the first value, change the second value to something like 10, plug that into the strength, and now we can see how the gradient is going from left to right. Now that isn't exactly what we want. We want it to go away from the camera, so we have to play around with the actual rotations. So let's rotate it about the z-axis by 90 degrees, and that did not work. So we'll rotate it by the y-axis by 90 degrees, and now you can't really see it, but that might be because it is behind the camera. So I'll go ahead and play around with the X location. Clearly something is happening, but right now I think the camera, it's taking not the camera object but my view. So I'll go ahead and press 0 to go into my camera view, and now I can actually see what's happening. If I move it on the x-axis, you can see how the gradient is working, which is perfectly all right. Along with that, just to see a little bit more, I'll go to my camera properties and change the focal length to something like 24, and that way it becomes a little wide angle camera and I can see a lot more of what's happening. Now this looks fine for the strength, but I want the color to have this gradient as well. So what I'll actually do is I'll take this multiply, bring it down and remove the connections, and I'll press Shift A and search for a color ramp node and take this color, plug it into the factor, and take this and plug it into the color. Now for the circles that are nearer to the camera, I don't want it to be black, I want it to be a blue. I'll just lift this up and give it the bluish hue. Along with that, I don't want it to be this saturated, so I'll change the saturation to 0.96. For the strength, I'll just go ahead and increase it to something like 10, and that should make it nice and bright. Next up, I don't want this to actually be just present as a solid circle. I want there to be some pulsations happening, and wherever there is no pulsation, I want it to be transparent. I'll press Shift A and search for a mixed shader node, plug that in after the emission, and for the second shader, I'll search for a transparent node. Now, even though we are using a transparent node, we won't be able to see any transparency because we have to go to the settings down here, change the blend mode to alpha blend, and we can switch off show back face. Along with that, I'll just switch off shadow mode by changing it from opaque to none, and now we actually have to choose the factor to decide which areas become transparent and which areas don't. For that, I'll use another wave texture and a color ramp for better control, and now if I plug this color into the factor, we should be able to start seeing something. Now these are my waves, but I don't want them to be like this. I want them to be more or less horizontal, I guess. So I'll play around with the different axes, and I think the y-axis is what I want, but I don't want so many of them to be present, so I'm going to reduce the scale to maybe 0.5. Next, I'll drag the black in, and you can see as the black comes in, these areas become more colored, so I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to drag the white in, which adds in more transparency. Now by playing around with this offset, we should get this nice cool animation for the lights as well, which I think looks pretty good, but I'm going to increase the scale to maybe 1, and that's the animation that I'm going to go for. So that looks all right. So I can actually just select my camera, go to viewport display, and increase passport out all the way to 1 so that nothing outside my camera view distorts. distracts me. Then we can move on to the next material. We'll deal with the walls, which is the most complex material after these circles. So for the walls, I'm just going to go ahead and increase the metallic value all the way to 1. However, for the roughness, I'm going to use a texture that we've done before on this channel, which is a Voronoi texture with the randomness changed all the way down to 0. And for the vector, we use another Voronoi texture, but we use the distance value to go in. Then you can search for a color ramp node, plug the color this time into the factor, and plug this color into the roughness. Now you might get some type of circles and things like that, so we'll change this from Euclidean to Chebyshev, and we'll do that for this Voronoi texture as well. And that way we get these squares. So let's actually increase the scale. Let's bring it up to something like 50. Let's reduce the randomness on this one as well down to 0. Reduce the scale on this one to maybe 2. And I feel like it's stretched too much on the y-axis. So I'll again press Ctrl T with the node wrangler switched on, switch it over to object, and now I can play around with the scaling again till I get exactly what I want. Of course, if these were not square after switching it to object, I would have gone ahead and played around with the scale values here to make them square. Apart from that, I don't want any area to be completely reflective or any area to be completely non-reflective. So I'll select this one, change the color from a value of 0 to a value of something like 0.2. And this one I'm going to have to select and change the value from 1 to something like 0.8. Apart from that, you can always crunch the values in if you feel like it, but it's really up to you and what you think suits best for your animation. Now that we have the walls done, we can continue with the material for the bridges. So for the bridges, I don't want anything too fancy. I'm just going to increase the metallicness all the way to 1, and they'll have their own reflections, which is good enough. For the panels, I want them to be completely black. So I'm going to go ahead and change this base color all the way to black, increase the metallicness and increase the roughness as well. And that way they'll remain as a pitch black. You don't want it to remain pitch black. You can start reducing the roughness by a little bit, and that way they'll get some reflections as well, which might be good for your scene. Finally, I'll deal with the floor. For the floor, I just want there to be some type of lines that are lit up. I'm going to do that using a slightly unusual method. I'm going to remove the principal BSDF and search for an emission node. However, for the colors of the emission node, I'm actually going to use a brick texture. Now, normally the color 1 and color 2 for the brick textures are bright and mortar is dark, but instead I'm going to change the mortar to a very bright color, and I'm going to change these colors to lower values of the same bluish color. After that, I can go ahead and increase the strength. Let's go up to something like 25, and that should be all right. I'm also going to reduce the saturation a bit, and I'm going to continue reducing the value as well till I feel like they're good enough. With that, I can go ahead and finally place my camera to exactly how it should be and start the animation. So for my camera, I'm actually going to increase the Z value by a bit, and then we can start off the animation for the camera. So let's set all of our animation defaults. So let's go to our output properties, change the frame rate to 30 frames per second, change the end frame to 150 so that it's a 5-second long animation. Output folder can be wherever you want it to be. File format, I'm going to choose FFmpeg video. Encoding, I'm going to change from Matroska to MPEG-4, and an output quality of perceptually lossless. Then on frame 0, I'm going to select the camera and tap I location, and then on frame 150, I'm going to press DY10 because the length of this entire cube that we created was 10, so it'll come perfectly to the end, and then tap I location, and then down here I'll just press T linear so that it becomes a smooth loop. However, obviously you see we just go to the end of the system. We don't want it to go to the end, we want it to continue further. So I'm going to have to select this, now press Alt D to create an instance of this geometry node object, and then press Y10 so that it moves to the end, and then press Shift R to just repeat that action a couple of times. Now this is what we have. It's really nice and bright, it looks good and all of that, but I want to play around with the actual gradient texture and all. So I'll go back over here, go to my circles, and for the gradient that's going from the camera, I'm going to change the X location a bit further so that there are a few more bluer regions. Apart from that, I want this gradient to be much less sharp, so I'm going to go down to the scaling and just scale this down to a smaller value, let's say maybe 0.1, and then bring it back on the X, and that way we just get a much smoother fall off. It might be hard to tell, but it is a much smoother fall off now. Then we want this last few to hide later on, so we'll do that when we deal with the actual world texture. So now we want these lights to keep animating, so let's go back to our circles material itself, go to frame 0, hover over the phase offset and change the value to 0 and tap I, then go to frame 150 and change the phase offset to a value of tau, which is 2 pi, and then tap I, and then select it, come down here, press T linear, and now if you play the animation, you'll have some animation on the actual lights as well, which I think looks sci-fi and looks really cool and works for this particular scenario. Next, to make this perfectly looping, we have to remove the last few edges over here. So for that, we could go to the world properties and add in a volume scatter as we generally do. However, the problem with volume scatter directly like this is that it affects everything nearby as well, and I don't want the things nearby to also face issues with the density. So even if I reduce the density to to 0.1, you can see that everything seems a lot less bright and we still have the end values being clipped off. We don't want that, so we are going to have to start increasing the density to something like this. Now, if the density is something like this, everything in front seems so dull. It's not as bright as it was before. So to fix that, we'll just select this and press Ctrl T with the node wrangler switched on, remove this image texture, so press X to delete it, and then just connect this back up to a gradient texture. So let's search for a gradient texture, plug that in, and do the exact same thing that we did for the gradient. So let's actually plug this into the density, search for a color ramp, plug this in so that we just have some more control. And now we want the gradient to go from the camera. So let's select the camera and plug that into the vector, and it has to go away. So remember exactly how we did that. So now you can see how the right side area has a lot of density and the left side area has no density. We want to rotate that. So if we rotate it about the Y by 90 degrees, we should have it go along the Y axis. So now we have to play around with the X value to bring it in. So we can just bring that in, and that way the areas towards the end has a lot of density and it fades out really nicely, whereas the areas nearby remain as bright as they were before. So I think that's perfectly all right. And if you're happy with everything, you can go ahead and render the animation. However, the last final touches that I generally like to do is go to my color management, change the look to something like high contrast. And of course, you can play around with making it standard as well. It's pretty much up to you. Hopefully this wasn't too long and there were a lot of things in between that you might have learned through the tutorial. If you liked this one, remember there are hundreds of tutorials present on my channel and there's a new one being added in every single day. Be sure to check out stuff that you haven't watched already, and until the next video comes out, thank you so much for watching. Keep creating and stay creative.